I do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge where we are here in the city of Santa Clara. Sure, many of you are accustomed to a land acknowledgement, but I don't want to take for granted having all of us come together from our various communities, our backgrounds, in order to learn about social justice. So we acknowledge that this training session is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to roughly 110 tribal nations. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous people. We affirm indigenous sovereignty and the living, resilient presence of Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone peoples throughout this region. So a land acknowledgement is an opportunity to recognize the inhabitants of the space that we're in and give homage and also recognition to their culture. I want to note that in the line of social justice, which we'll get into, there are scholars and activists who also think about what are ways to move beyond land acknowledgement. So I want to highlight one in particular, Megan Red Shirtshaw, and her information is listed there, but she is a director of Native Student Services at the University of South Dakota, and she challenges institutions to move beyond a land acknowledgement statement to say, what is our institutional priority or goal to acknowledge students as they come on our campus as Indigenous? So she has some ideas around thinking about educational institutions and also offering free higher education for Indigenous people. So if you're interested in learning more ways, I have a hyperlink there for you. Our agreements for today. A lot of what we talk about today is a skill, and oftentimes when we talk about community agreements, we may not associate them with being skill sets, but we are developing skill sets each time we come together collectively to talk to people across lines of difference for a common goal. So there are some that I like to note, such as listen actively, respect others when they are talking. And these are also community agreements that you could use with your students. Though I would say if you use these with your students, it's best to create a safe space for them to name what they need in order to feel successful as learners and to feel safe. But you can still use some of these. Speak from your own experiences. Often when we are in spaces and having conversations, it can feel more comfortable to generalize and speak on behalf of a group. But for the purposes of this meeting and this training, I really encourage you to speak from your own perspective and see this as an opportunity to harness your voice, recognizing that you may have some similarities in experiences and comments with others here, but it also may be some differences. So speak from your own perspective. Don't yum my yuck. And this is one you can use for students as well. So when someone expresses a viewpoint, do not judge them for their comments or their opinions. One mic, you want to recognize when one person is talking to honor that. Be conscious of body language and nonverbal responses. Confidentiality, respect, the pass rule. No one here is obligated to speak, and your participation alone does contribute to this environment. And then equity of voice, beware of participation, because some people may like to speak more than others. I like to speak, but I always like to try to practice being a listener as well. So our learning objectives today, first, to explore evidence-based practices for teaching children and youth to engage socially and intellectually with others in a community of learners on race, racism, and social justice. And social justice topics could run the gamut, and we'll get into that. We also want to define intentional measurable outcomes for teaching social justice education. And lastly, think about what are some strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. So as we go through this presentation and I present you with different ways to teach social justice education, think about the context that you'll go back into and what might be, if you will, a SWOT analysis or some ways to think about how you could have it successful. And I'll have some questions around that. I want to begin by unifying us together with the definition for equity. It's equity that brings us here. It's equity that led me to this profession that I'm in. And so I like this definition from the National Equity Project, but it's also one that we hone at the Inclusion Collaborative in terms of our work around the Ways to Equity playbook. And that is each student receives what they need, when they need it to thrive socially, emotionally, and academically. Another way to think of it is, in essence, educational equity means that every student can go to school and feel that they belong, are valued, and can succeed. So I want to share a brief story about what this means for me as an individual. I'm local in that I grew up in the Bay Area. I'm from East Palo Alto, California. I attended schools there from kindergarten through 8th grade. And I also lived in and they're still there, the apartment complex, the Light Tree Apartments. And during my childhood there, I had the fortunate experience of growing up in a diverse, politically conscious, racial conscious environment. My teachers were African American. My classmates were from different backgrounds, from Samoa, Tonga. I had classmates who were Fijian. I had classmates who were Mexican American, El Salvadorian, multi-ethnic, everything. And that pretty much was emblematic of my experience in the apartment complex where I grew up. We got along very well, and it was a lot of culture, a lot of sharing, and so forth. And I bring that up to say, students enter our school environments with a cultural lens or a socialization background that really says a lot about their identity and how they see the world. So for me, my understanding of equity came into play when I made the shift from attending public school to private school as a 14-year-old. So though I lived in an environment where I was joyful and I love my schoolings and I love my teachers, I still talk to my teachers to this day. I didn't know, that I was living in poverty. I didn't know that I was living in government housing. And I didn't see myself, honestly, as lacking anything. So I made the shift to attend a private school. And part of what came out of that decision was a teacher who pulled me aside and said, at that time, there was no high school in the city of East Palo Alto. So students were bused to school across the Bay Area, particularly within the Sequoia Unified School District. So it was common once you reach 8th grade that you would be prepared based on what part of the city you lived in to be bused to a school. And so my teacher approached me and she framed it to say, do you want to be in a small classroom environment? Do you want to go to college, and so forth? And if in hindsight, a narrow way to think about it, that there's only one way to get towards college. But at the time, that seemed like the most plausible option for me. And so I went for it. And so here's where the equity and the inclusion and the belonging comes in. My first week on campus was unlike any other experience that I've had in my life, but it's actually shaped the trajectory of my life. So I'll just start with day 4. Day 4, I had to go to the cafeteria alone for the first time. Up until that point, I was joint to the hip with my friend that came from the same public school that I attended, Elisa. And I felt comfortable with her. But without her, I did not feel comfortable going to my locker alone, going to the bathroom. And I even felt anxious going into my classrooms because weren't there many students of color, there were no African American students in my class. So I was going through a culture shock. But on that 4th day, my friend had to meet with her teacher after class, which means I had to muster up the courage to go to the cafeteria and eat on my own. And I did, because I needed to eat. And I remember walking to the cafeteria anxious, but the moment that resonates with me even to this day is that when I walked in the dining hall and I looked around, I didn't see a single person of color. And I went into a complete panic and experienced emotions that I've never experienced before. And I really didn't know what to do with that. But the only thing that was on my mind is go hide somewhere. So I managed to make my way to the library, which is about a 6 or 7 minute walk. And I found refuge in a bathroom stall. And I cried and I cried, and many thoughts came up for me. What was I thinking? I'm without my friends. How is this going to work? I don't belong here. I don't see anyone that looked like me. But it was an upperclassman who knocked on the bathroom stall, and she encouraged me to open the door. And when I did, she embraced me and pretty much told me, she introduced herself as an upperclassman. She wanted to know my name, where I came from. And she just encouraged me to think about that there were people in the community that would embrace me and care for me and so forth. And what she did, it changed me. She walked me to the guidance counselor, which at the time, I didn't see the guidance counselor as a psychologist or think of it as SES or anything. It's just a person that I felt comfortable with. And that began my understanding of what true equity is. If you are in an environment to cultivate a learning situation for a student, they have to feel like that's a place that they want to come to, and that they could come and be courageous and that they could learn. So equity is very personal for me, not just in my life, my family life, but in other people's children's lives and so forth. So I wanted to share that. So I encourage you all to think about what this work means for you as well. In the Ways to Equity playbook, there are some different opportunities to think about how you will work towards equity, such as promoting just and fair inclusion, and that can mean many different things. Also, removing the predictability of success and failure. So I encourage you all to take a look at the playbook, because there are some excellent examples in here, as well as some audits that you could use for your site or your school to diagnose how your school is doing in this area. So now we get into social justice, a topic that I think about often. I want you to turn to the people at your table and respond to this question. What's your definition of social justice? And for those on Zoom, if you could also as well comment, what is your definition of social justice? So we'll take about a minute. So if you could just turn to the people around you and answer that question. What's social justice? Yeah, yeah. For all of our participants on Zoom, I encourage you to use the chat. If you could add your definition in the chat, that'll be wonderful. And more importantly, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please do not hesitate to add them in the comments. So if you can hear my voice, just raise your hand. I would like to hear a definition. Coming into this space, how are you all defining social justice? As an educator, perhaps as a parent, a teacher, a facilitator yourself, or as a learner, how do you define social justice? Is there any volunteer that would like to share a definition that's coming up for you in this space? Yes. Mhm. Okay, thank you. Others? Mm. Thank you both for your definitions. So as one who's taught this work for quite some time now, there's not a set definition for it. And in fact, each institution will take on a meaning of what this looks like. So what I want to provide is a framework for thinking about this that could be transferable and useful to you. But I came across a definition that resonates with some of the work that I'm doing and what I see in terms of the school spaces. And can I have a volunteer read this definition, please? The goal of self-justice education is to enable individuals to develop the critical analytical tools necessary to understand the structural features of oppression and their own socialization within a specific. Social justice education aims to help participants develop awareness, knowledge, and processes to examine issues of justice and injustice in their personal lives, communities, and the body. Thank you for reading that definition. There's a lot embedded in this definition. And what I want to highlight is the word critical, empowering our students to be critical and have a critical analytical lens about the information that they consume, including the knowledge in the classroom, what they see on social media, what they're learning in the different communities that they have to go through, and also understanding who they are in this conversation around oppression, which we'll get into. And we have to acknowledge that for some students, if you think about my story, I wasn't aware of what oppression was, or that I was living in a situation that I was quote unquote oppressed. And I still don't look at it that way. However, there are some things about my upbringing and my socialization process that does reflect some systemic oppression, given the living conditions and some of what I witnessed in my upbringing. Yes. Can I ask a question? Yes. Okay.
I have a real problem when we talk about empowerment.
Okay.
Fundamentally, because they already are empowered, right? The power exists in them. It's not ours to give them. It's ours to remove the barriers that stifle that power that they already have. So maybe it's semantics, but it always it feels off to me when you say we're gonna give voice to or empower, or we use kind of this language that feels like it's us giving something to the children that they really already have, that we have either stripped from them or we have placed barriers around them. So for me, it may be semantics, but it feels to me like we're not actually giving them anything, we're just stopping and taking it away from them. And so fundamentally, I feel like that it's a question that I have is something that's positive.
I appreciate your perspective a lot. In fact, it has everything to do with this conversation around positionality. So I interpret it completely differently. And that's predicated on my firsthand personal experience, where not everyone saw themselves as an agent in change or felt in power. Because from my personal firsthand experience, a lot of people in my community and where I was from, including myself, that wasn't really aware of everything that was going on. I was just doing school. I knew that showing up meant something, that meant my participation, that equated to being good. I also knew that turning in my assignments equated to doing good work. And I also noticed through the language in the community that was being communicated that I was gifted. And so I think there's something to be said about the role of an educator to help a student harness their voice. Some students may already have it, absolutely, but it's very general to say that all students have that. And I think that being mindful of who we are as educators when we start that conversation is really what I want to emphasize with the social justice work, to name, right? And having those conversations with students. This is who I am. This is my upbringing. This is how I've experienced it. Tell me what this looked like for you. So I take a slightly different approach developmentally working with students, because I don't like to assume that they know what I know as an adult. I'm still unpacking my K through 12 education, and I'm not going to say my age. So we're kind of, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. So, but thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Empowered feel respected, heard,
yes,
and supported, and without, I guess what's the thing like, here you have the power.
Right. Inquiry-based questions. I would say the approach is inquiry-based questions, meaning you have the students in the classroom, you have them in an environment, and asking them, tell me, what do you see in this school? What's working for you in this classroom? How are you experiencing this learning? How are you connecting with your peers? Giving them an opportunity to communicate and voice what they're seeing. So I would say more of an inquiry approach and no assumption by giving them answers or feeding them what you necessarily want them to say. But it's okay to ask those questions and understand that some students may or may not have an answer in that moment, but getting them to name what they're seeing around them and how they're experiencing it. So I would say that is a useful approach that I've seen work. And it's one that I employ with students, not just in higher education spaces, but also when I worked in a high school environment. And we'll have more time to get into this more, but if it comes back up, we'll continue to talk about it. But it is connected to the why we have a conversation around social justice education. So I want to add, this is not something that I found in a textbook. This is being drawn from my experience in working with students. And I see 4 pillars to this type of work around the why it's useful. One is around habits of mind. And there is some research on that, which I'll share in the next slide. I think about it in terms of academic skill sets, as well as scholarly evidence, and we will unpack what evidence look like. And then also theoretical tools. Now, the language behind this, you could shift this to the environment that you're in with your students. But for educators, I do think it's important to know where some of this concept and this work around social justice comes from. So let's start with the first one. around habits of mind. Habits of mind simply says we work with students becoming the expert reader, writer, and thinker who succeeds in school. So meeting them where they are, but also knowing that we believe that they can exceed. It starts with the mindset of when we look out and see our students. And to contextualize what that has looked like in my life, I've seen it with language. I could speak from my experience of working in a public school setting where some students were still emerging language learners who still showed up to class, but the pace of class will feel faster, or the information had to be broken down and explained and reiterated multiple times. But the goal was that they still would be able to participate and feel like the classroom space was for them as well. So it's those nuances of the different type of learners that show up in the classroom, but the actual belief around the habits of mind. And I'll go more into this. So this is a concept, if you would like to learn more about this, that comes from an article called Critical Habits of Mind, Exposing the Process of Development in 2013. I like this approach in terms of thinking of social justice. A lot of it I've seen in some examples around persisting, managing impulsivity, listening with understanding and empathy, thinking flexibility, thinking about your thinking, that piece on metacognition is something that I've seen in the recent years of teaching students to reflect on how they think and where knowledge come from. Striving for accuracy, and the list goes on and on. But I do want to pause just to give you all time to process the illustration that's up there. You're in a classroom setting and you're going to discuss topics around race or gender or poverty and so forth. So let's move to application. What would this look like? One of the questions that I like to pose with students, and this falls under social justice around critical mindset and habits of mind, is getting them to think about the connection between who they are and what they know. Like how do those two come together? So to say that what you know is connected to who you are, what does that mean to you? So that is a question that you could ask students in that middle school space particularly, and also the high school space, and of course, like in the higher education space. So I want you all to think about that for yourself. What does it mean to say that what you know is connected to who you are? And let's do this whole discussion. Anyone have a response to that? What you know is connected to who you are. Where does your knowledge come from? Could you say more about that, please?
You know what you're learning,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that you have to reach out to learn other things that you aren't.
Okay. Can I ask a little bit more if that's okay? Is there a particular example that has showed up in your life? Okay. Others? Yes. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that. Someone else. What you know is connected to who you are. Okay. Mhm.
And that would be, so it's like, okay, it's not just like experience.
Mhm.
It's also community, family, all those people that, the generational, you know, that make up who I am, and like the gentleman was just saying, but it's who you are. I was just thinking, that's how I get things. Okay, I can't teach what I don't know.
Okay.
Right? And so there's sort of like try to make it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Yes.
Every person has a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that every person that passes one person's life, that's something that they will always hold on to. Whether it's within experience or everything. And then, so
Thank you for sharing that. And I would also say that teachers represent that as well. And for our students, thinking about culturally what that means to show up in the classroom and how, in some instances, teachers are revered and the knowledge is accepted as a truth. The example that comes to mind for me when I think about knowledge connected to who you are and what you know, I think of two things. Number one, in my firsthand experience, and for many students that I taught, stories around Christopher Columbus, for instance. I see some head nods. Mm-hmm. Right? You grow up, you're being told this story of who Christopher Columbus is. He discovered America. He did all of these things. But what happens when you learn more about the context behind that story and what the gaps are and what the actual truth is? For many of our students, their knowledge of the world and their experiences has everything to do with the environments and the settings that they are in. And though there can be some truth, what social justice says, let's look at this critically and think about what your thoughts and what you're bringing into this conversation, simply to identify where is it coming from. Another example that comes to mind, I mentioned my personal upbringing with African-American teachers in an environment with culturally rich and diverse students. I knew everything about history. I knew everything about the experience of Blacks in this country because my teachers were pro-Black. So yes, I was a third grader. Yes, I was a fourth grader, but I learned a lot about slavery, civil rights, and so forth, and became quite competent because that's how my teacher modeled it. That was my definition of history before I made it to high school. But that's just a silo of what could happen in a particular classroom. Another student of a different age group in a different school setting could have had a completely different experience with the teacher that they had. What we're talking about is when those students collectively show up in your classroom as middle school students, as high school students, and processing the world around them, that is what's at play when they're having this dialogue and they're having these conversations. So getting them to think about how do they know what they know is a first critical step around habits of the mind. It's not limited to that. Some other questions that you could think about with your students is getting them to identify what's the difference between critical thinking and opinion. What it would look like for them to fully participate if grades were off the table. If the grades weren't an issue, what would participating look like for them? So giving them some opportunity to name how they see themselves as being successful. Also thinking about their peers as being members of the community that they're in. So what degree of responsibility am I willing to take for getting the most out of this class? Some things you want to have them think about. And what degree of responsibility am I willing to take to support my peers in getting the most from this class? And it could be listening and acknowledging when their peers are coming from. So this is meant to it's not meant to be easy. It's meant to pause and almost undo or unlearn our typical way of processing the environment that we're in when we're in the classroom. And it does take time, but a way to facilitate this with young people, it could be through a free write. Like any of these particular questions, of course, with some guidance behind the definition and the meaning, and having them do a quick free write on their responses to any of these questions. So this is around habits of the mind. This just skims the surface of how deep this could go. So I encourage you to take a look at the particular article. We're going to practice this. Yeah, we're going to practice this. So in a moment, I am going to share a parable with you all. And in your small groups, I want you to read the parable just together, process it and read it together. So this is a parable, Hodja and the Foreigner, and it comes from the Tales of Nazareth and Hodja, and this comes from a short story. So I'm going to have you all read this together, and just so you know where we're going to discuss your interpretation of this parable, and then spend some time reflecting what went into your understanding of what you read. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to give you all time in your small groups to read it. We could actually begin by reading it together, and then I'll give you some time to reflect since you all don't have a handout. So we're going to unpack this a bit. If it helps, I would encourage you to take a picture of this with your phone, because I'm going to move to the next slide that has some specific questions for your group to discuss. So this is a parable. And what I want to do here is highlight what happens when you have students in the class together discussing a particular topic. Same topic, people may ascribe different meaning. That's what we're doing here. This comes from a book called Introduction to Social Justice. So here are some questions to consider. What is the assumption each is making about the other? And what is the cost of these assumptions? What are the different ways in which each organizes his world? What are the differences in values? And if they coexist, what factor will determine which of these men is going to have to learn to understand the perspective of the other? So I want to give you some time in your group to discuss. Let's start to answer these questions. This is meant to be an exercise, a brief exercise, because there's more in store, but I do want to spend some time unpacking it a bit. So based on your discussions, is there anyone that would like to share what is the assumption each is making about the other, and what is the cost of these assumptions? Now, I heard some conversations going on too. So is there anyone that would like to get us started? Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Would anyone else like to add? What are the different ways in which each organizes his world? Yes.
Well, there's three groups.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
First one, foreigners trying to communicate with the whole God. So the whole God was interpreting the
Communication.
to the village. So they could understand. So it says it's trying to translate so they can understand.
Thank you. What are the, yes. Mm-hmm. That is true. That's true. Oh, you're going to pass around. Do you mind repeating that in the chat? They can. Yeah.
Pass those around because I'm trying to tap.
Okay. I can walk around.
I said about the assumption is that each person is assuming that the other person is understanding what they're saying.
Thank you. How about the values? What are the differences in values?
Well, the foreigner was like was geared towards exploration. That's why it's like earth and evaporation science, while the Hoja is more values community, because he talks about the bread, sharing it,
Thank you. Wonderful. So if they coexist, what factor will determine which one of these men is going to have to learn to understand the perspective of the other? If you're doing the chat, yeah, it's fine.
The first paragraph, like the gentleman was just saying, that it was more scientific. And the next paragraph is kind of saying that it's more about connecting with nature around, how do you interpret the nature. In the third paragraph, it's more like about food, survival.
Yes.
I was also thinking the foreigner was coming in with the assumption he'd be talking to somebody very wise.
Mhm.
He asked, and I thought it was definitely a reflection of who they led him to, of what was valued in their community, and that whatever his knowledge base was something that was going to probably be looked at from the community or the mass as something that is shared.
Right. So this gets into the social construction of knowledge and who controls the narrative of what our students are learning and what's being taught and what the expectation is that we have of even how we assess what we're discussing. And again, we're looking at this through the lens of social justice on topics where there's not always going to be the same opinion or agreement even of how to even solve some of these topics. And some takeaways that I want you all to note about this parable and this exercise is that each of us has a culturally based worldview. We hold a common assumption that people share our same worldview, but that's not always the case. Not only through across lines of differences, but even belonging in the same social group of someone. And we often assume that what we intend to communicate is what is received, and that is untrue. So part of this social justice work, when we talk about those community norms and being an active listener, that is where it turns into a statement and then into a skill set of actually being able to practice that. So this is an example of social justice habits of mind as a reference or a starting point to begin the conversations. You may not use the parable with your students. You may find a different example. You may have them watch an episode of Pocahontas, for example, and have them discuss what they've known about that story and some of the facts that were left out of how it's been taught in Disney and so forth. So there's many ways that you can do it, but it's all about getting them to think about the construction of knowledge, the knowledge that they have and the knowledge of the world around them. There's the other pillar connected to this, and this is academic skills. And the goal for academic skills is fostering critical thinking and discussion of issues, the interrelated topics of race, for example, class, gender, sexual identity, poverty, and even environmental justice. And you all will have access to these slides. So as I go through the definitions, just know that it might be useful if you want to take a look at them again. So what does this mean? It's two things going on. Academic skill sets in terms of students' ability to write, of course, verbal, nonverbal communication, listening, note-taking, reasoning. These are just some examples of academic skill sets, but where they tie into social justice is them having knowledge and understanding of issues related to one's social identity. So ableism, oppression, racism, social stratification, and so forth. It really just depends on the direction you will want to go with students. But I'm finding in my experience that students bring to the classroom what they're experiencing, sometimes in their home life, sometimes in their community, as well as what they're seeing on the news. And that is where having something, an approach to addressing it through social justice education can be useful if you want to be that person in your community to facilitate the conversation, while also knowing that you actually don't have control of what's going to come out of the student's mouth. But you can have some pillars in place to facilitate that process for them and make sure that they're being heard. So what does this look like? So students will be able to define the experiences of those who live on the fringe of mainstream America or marginalized groups. So in the context of social justice, there are known groups and issues and experiences that individuals and collectively groups have that students are privy to, or perhaps sometimes they want to learn more about. So LGBTQ, what does it mean to have an identity? What does it mean to experience oppression in that sense? That's an example. but it also could be even for senior citizens, understanding their experiences, military combat veterans. So these are people who, again, will be considered marginalized or living on the fringe of mainstream. Racial, cultural minorities, in my experience, that tends to be the topic that comes up the most. Students unpacking their experiences around racism, microaggressions, and so forth. But with social justice education, it says that there are many topics we could discuss with our students. And often it can overlap with race and culture. Persons living in poverty. That could be a domestic perspective, but it's not limited to domestic. It could be through a global perspective of what poverty is. Autism spectrum persons, and these are just examples, hearing, visually, and physically challenged persons, and persons with a serious or persistent mental illness. It's not limited to this, but these are some examples of marginalized groups and where social justice conversations can fall. So one of the ways to teach this, and there's many ways to tackle it, but I found that students respond to this approach and this conceptual framework through the National Equity Project when they discuss this conversation around oppression through the individual and then through the systemic. And what that does is it allows students to think about personal beliefs that they have, the beliefs around people around them. So that could be conscious or unconscious. So your response when you see someone of a different background, when you see someone from a different ability, what does all that mean and where is all that stemming from? This is where this type of approach can be very helpful. And I highlight two in particular around racism and internalized racism. That's the example that I want to discuss today, but you also could think of it from any other example. So starting with racism, an initial conversation is asking students to define racism. How do they define racism? And you might find that some students in their example are thinking of individual acts of unkindness or meanness or discrimination or prejudice, whereas some students may get straight into the institution. This is what the police are doing in my community and it's not right, or they're doing it in my school, or this is how we treat unhoused persons. Another way that you would say that is homeless, but we will use the word unhoused typically now. Some students will have those institutional and structural examples. It really can run the gamut, but having some approach to say, think of it individual and systemics, it just creates space for everyone to put forth their definitions. Again, we're thinking about an expert learner. That means that students should be able to share the knowledge that they have or what they're thinking on this particular topic without judgment, so where they actually can grow. That's part of our role as educators to create this space. And we're the adults, and our perspective and lived experience may not always be the same. So being aware of that. So what might this look like in terms of an exercise as a first step? I want to focus on the internalized racism component of this as it relates to the racism. So those private beliefs and thoughts, many things that you can do, but one in particular is to get them to discuss the topic of implicit bias. So questions like, what is implicit bias? And these questions are for you all as well. How is implicit bias different from racism? Again, students are going to have a definition of racism, and there's all these terminology related to social justice. And a part of this is creating a baseline understanding of what these terms mean. So what's the difference? How does implicit bias lead to discrimination like racism towards marginalized groups? What do implicit bias or racism have to do with peanut butter and jelly? We're going to get into this video in a minute. And what's an example of implicit bias that you have experienced, witnessed, or heard about? So creating some space for them to talk about their experiences. I want to show a quick video. Hopefully the link works. Let's see. Come on, internet. So it's not loading, but this is a really great video to take a look at. It's about 3 or 4 minutes that gets into the topic of implicit bias. At this stage of this part of the social justice, this is students are thinking about the inside, who they are, the world around them. This says, What's happened to you? What's been your experience with discrimination? What's been your experience with people in your family? In my lifetime, what that has looked like is mass incarceration, 3 strikes. That is something that if you would have asked me as a child, by actually giving me this particular language, I would have named that, but I actually never talked about that as a youth. I didn't even think of that as oppression because it happened everywhere around me. It was just what it meant to live in my community. You have a loved one in jail. So when I say part of this is creating space for our students, some may be aware, but others may not necessarily be aware or have had an opportunity to talk about what they're experiencing. This is a good way to bring that forth. And understanding our limitations in the moment, right? Like being able to communicate to students when this type of stuff comes up, that it doesn't have to end there, that there's support, there's resources. It could be people on campus and people that you know about and all that to help them further unpack these experiences. But this is just to get them talking. So some things for you to think about right now is what resonates with you so far and what are you wrestling with? Just give yourself time to think about it, because there are 2 more pillars that we'll get into and then we'll close out. Okay. Similarly, in the chat, if you want to comment what resonates with you so far and what are you wrestling with. And I do want to pause and open it up for anyone in the room that has something that you would like to share related to this. If anything's resonating with you or you have questions or something that's coming up. Okay. Let us continue. The 3rd pillar is around scholarly evidence. And this could be debated, like, what is scholarly evidence, right? Does it have to be scholarly for it to be evidence? That's a question too you could get into with your students. But really what it comes down to is joining the conversation on complex issues with no easy answers in which people in society don't always agree. This is crucial because students are gaining their information from TikTok, and some people are informed scholars, and some may not be a scholar at all. But a lot of the information oftentimes is one-sided and it's not informed. And so we have an opportunity to present them with some facts and present them with some authors or some work around these particular topics that could be very useful so that they are actually critically analyzing and thinking about the topic in a way that could be useful for them should they want to work on these particular topics. So basically is resources by academics, and I want to emphasize other experts, because an expert is not always someone that's in academics, that contribute to knowledge in a particular field by sharing news, findings, theories, analysis, insights, and summaries, and so forth. Giving acknowledgement to this evidence piece for students around the conversation around social justice is important, because we don't want them just to accept what they're seeing is always the truth, but we also want to teach them how to look for fact versus opinion, how to look for the evidence. What I like to teach my students is to think about, you just said something to me. Who wrote that? Who is that person? Let's just take a moment and do our due diligence. Where does this person fit in this conversation around socialization? What is their positionality? Is this about a marginalized group? Is that person from a marginalized group? Okay, yes, this person is. Are they from a marginalized group? No, they're not. Are they contributing to knowledge that you already have about this experience of being a part of this marginalized group? Really getting them to know that it is okay to grapple with and analyze the information that they're consuming around this particular topic. And the way to facilitate this, I like to call it, just for language for our students, readings. It could be a journal article. It doesn't have to be a journal article. It could be a book, an expert from a book, a chapter in a book. You could utilize that. Viewings of film, documentaries on YouTube, Netflix, Amazon Prime. There's a lot of great content out there to work with. It's not always perfect, but it can be a starting point for our students to have these conversations. And also listenings is another way to help students search for scholarly evidence. So that's NPR podcast episodes. It really is inviting students to bring into the space how they will want to go about addressing these particular topics. And I've hyperlinked some examples that may be useful. toward the end. And one, for instance, that work for younger students is like StoryCorps. Everyday people who experience issues around social justice, they call in, they tell their story, and they turn it into an animation. If you were to use it in a class, it takes about 2 or 3 minutes, but there's some really powerful stories in there that could be useful for students. Podcast episodes, all of that, and so forth. So connected to the conversation around getting back to racism, some language that a student will walk away understanding from using or utilizing one of those types of evidence that they will be able to know to talk about disproportionality. Again, it could be the case that students have awareness of the topics that you're talking about, but all it is building on what they may or may not know to equip them with some language or some tools to enter the conversation, because they very well could become that writer of a piece, not necessarily later on in life, but even at their age to be able to start telling the stories that are around them. So here's an example. How am I doing on time? Because I do want to show this one. This is where I talk about the scholarly evidence. I think this is actually, I highlighted in the enhancement for African-American students as an approach that's not only around evidence that students could use to focus on, let's say, school discipline or disproportionality, but it's also culturally relevant pedagogy at best. So I want to show it very briefly. And also note that if you use the hyperlink there, you can actually get an expert of that, the written format. But I want to show it, a part of it very briefly, because I want to be mindful of everyone's time and then begin to close us out. Oh, let me pull this up here. Internet is not my friend right now. Oh, it is. So let's see if I'm able to get in here. Let's see, play.
Why did I get promoted?
I'm going to show a minute or so.
And because I'm using words.
Evidence. Let's play it. Yes, absolutely.
They don't care about sitting in courtroom.
Okay. This is to address disproportionality. This is what this looks
They
like.
don't care if our babies thrive at school, long as they get by at school. Get by institutionalized racism and intergenerational oppression systems that keep prison pipelines thriving. Disguised as willful defiance, I'm trying to understand why urban schools have the highest rates of incarceration instead of culturally relevant curriculum that should be liberation. Suspensions from school feel like eternity. Strategically guide the Black and brown kids out when we truly come to school to get free. Stifle academic and social emotional education. I'm just saying, could this be racially motivated? Outcomes being primarily Black and brown youth become academically stagnated, leading to suspensions, expulsions, less school participation, stereotypes perpetuated. Is your school pedagogy discipline or human elevation? Discipline data.
I want to end there. I would encourage you to take a look at this, but this is an example that you could use or invite into your space in the conversation with students on a topic such as school discipline related to social justice. So I want to prepare to close us out here. Okay. The other one is exploring theoretical tools like narrative and ethnography. Again, critical pedagogy. You can get into intersectionality as a way to talk about these social justice topics. And so one way to do that is creating an opportunity for students to tell a story about their life. Okay. And you could think about what comes to mind if you're reflecting on the role of social justice education in your life and a story that will come to mind. Think about where it resonates with you, what you're wrestling with. Okay, so let's go over these pillars to close us out, bringing it all together. So the first concept, it was around the habits of mind, and an outcome. I'll let you read the objective there, but an outcome that could come out of that objective is students being able to explain how what they know is connected to who they are. We get into the academic skill sets, thinking about critical thinking and discussions around poverty and topics. An outcome of that will be students will be able to define marginalized groups and concepts such as racism. Scholarly evidence, their ability to be able to draw upon the works of individuals that's out there to talk about the complex issues related to social justice. And the outcome of that could be many different things, but it's also them being able to recognize the knowledge around social justice education, and then the theoretical tools to explore key approaches around tools and theories, and that could lead to them being able to write about their personal story. So I encourage you with this type of approach is to do a SWOT analysis and think about what are some strengths around this work that's already happening at your school site or your organization, or just an idea that you have that you want to work on. What are some weaknesses? What are some opportunities? What are some threats? So there are some questions there you could use. And I went ahead and added some readings, some viewings and listenings to help you facilitate that process should you carry this out. But I also want to acknowledge for anyone in the room that's been doing this work for a long time, that's always and has been facilitating these conversations. Thank you, because our students need it. And as much as like we could think that they have those opportunities, it may not necessarily be the case where they have someone that's actually in their corner to be able to talk about stuff. That could be very difficult if they're experiencing it themselves. So thank you for being here today. I will have these slides here. And if you have questions for me, I'll be here afterwards. But also don't hesitate to get in contact with me if you want to continue this conversation. Thank you.